This gathering, and thank you so much for joining us. The name of our gathering today is Writing and Talking About Memoir, Little Brother. My name is Laura Mickham, and I'm the director of the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke University. I'm facilitating the program today along with my colleague, Bingham Center librarian, Kelly Wooten. After covering a few logistical details, I look forward to introducing our wonderful speaker, Sallie Bingham. We'll paste the logistical details into the chat as it's a lot of information. We will be recording this event, and we ask you to mute your audio and turn off your cameras during Ms. Bingham's readings and remarks. Ms. Bingham will read and speak for about 20 minutes, after which she and I will have a question and answer exchange, followed by an open Q&A period with all of you. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat or use the raised hand feature in the reaction section of the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Kelly Wooten will facilitate this part of the discussion. We ask for your understanding if we have technical issues. If our speaker's internet connection becomes unstable, we will ask for your patience as we work to resolve this. If this does not work, or we have other disruptions that we cannot resolve, we'll end the meeting with the hopes of recording the talk and sharing it with all who registered. If you'd like to stay in touch with the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture, we're providing links to join our email list, to receive our newsletter, and to follow our social media channels. To purchase a copy of Little Brother or other books by Ms. Bingham, please follow the link that will also be placed in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce writer, teacher, feminist activist, and generous and visionary philanthropist, Sallie Bingham. About her life as a writer, Ms. Bingham has said, quote, "I'd been writing since I literally could write. Terrifying ghost stories my first grade class was persuaded to perform. Sentimental poems sent to my father overseas in World War II. Short stories that began to win prizes by the time that I was in high school. The Dana Reed Prize at Harvard for Best Undergraduate Writing, the first time it was given to a woman. And a request from editor Ann Barrett at Houghton Mifflin to see a novel," unquote. In 1961, not long after Bingham graduated from college, Houghton Mifflin published that novel. It was followed by 7 more novels, 5 collections of short stories, 3 collections of poetry, numerous plays, and an assemblage of short stories, a novella, and a play published in 2020 by Sarah Ban Books entitled Treason, a Sallie Bingham Reader. Bingham has also published 4 works of nonfiction, including the work we are here today to celebrate, Little Brother, a Memoir, just published last month by Sarah Ban Books. Readers familiar with Sallie Bingham's 1989 memoir, Passion and Prejudice, will remember her provocative chronicle of the Bingham family saga, cited by Gloria Steinem as a, quote, "major step toward feminist change and democracy," unquote. In Little Brother, she reflects on just one of her siblings, her youngest brother, Jonathan, a deeply sensitive person who suffered from insecurity, isolation, and difficulty relating to his large family. Bingham draws from archival material, including the young man's journal and letters. As in each of her previous memoirs, in addition to bringing these documents to life, she offers critical historical context and makes vital connections across generations to create an intimate portrait of her complex family. Award-winning author and artist Joan Brooks Baker responded to Little Brother saying, quote, "Brava, Sallie Bingham, for an intimate and courageous portrait of the complexities of her family in all its pose, love, and need for emotional distractions. This compelling personal story is set against the backdrop of decades of world history, and in part reflects the American character, its values, and thus the consequences. I was totally immersed," unquote. Bingham's writings have appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, New Letters, Plainswoman Plainsong, Greensboro Review, Negative, Capability, the Connecticut Review, and Southwest Review, among others, and have been anthologized in many collections, such as Best American Short Stories, 40 Best Stories for Mademoiselle, Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, and the Harvard Advocate Centennial Anthology. In addition, she's worked as an editor and a critic in a number of organizations, including as book editor for the Louisville Courier Journal and as a guest editor at Mademoiselle a few years before Sylvia Plath, or after Sylvia Plath held that post, and as a director of the National Book Critics Circle. As a part of her long and profound commitment to enhancing and documenting women's lives, Bingham co-founded Women's Project and Productions, the nation's oldest and largest company dedicated to producing and promoting theater created by women. The Kentucky Foundation for Women, an organization that promotes positive social change by supporting varied feminist expression in the arts, and of course, the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture here at Duke University. Describing her oeuvre, Publishers Weekly observed in 2011 that, quote, Bingham's work remains sharp and deliciously unsettling, ripe for discovery by a new generation of readers. Little Brother certainly bears this out. Please join me in welcoming Sallie Bingham. Thank you, Sallie.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, Laura. What a treat for me.
You're welcome to start anytime that you feel so moved.
All right. Do you want me to start by reading something?
I would. I think that would be lovely.
That's the best way to do. This memoir, Little Brother, I'm just going to hold it up in case you can see it, even with backwards title. It's just out a month ago by Sarah Band Press, my longtime publisher. And I'm going to start by reading the prologue, which is quite short, and I think it'll give you an idea of why I'm writing this book. It starts with a quote from William Faulkner from his novel, The Sound and the Fury. And it takes a little explaining, so I'll read it first and then I'll explain it. Again is even sadder than was. It is the saddest word of all. And a lot of the reason I write and keep writing is to try to prevent disastrous repetition. And that's what I think Faulkner is talking about. To have something happen again is even sadder than to say that it did happen, because it means you're caught in some kind of a pattern. So this is the prologue. I call it the dreadful list. 8 of my close relatives died in various accidents before the age of 50. Their deaths were often suicide. Then I have a long list, which I will spare you. Of this list, there are 2 names that strike me closely. My younger brother, Jonathan Worth Bingham, and my youngest son, William Bingham Iovenko, uncle and nephew. This memoir, built on a few facts, a handful of Jonathan's papers, and my memory, is my version of Jonathan's life and death. Others will have other versions. But since he has been dead for 58 years, many of those who knew him are also dead, and the interest that is maintained in his life and death has dwindled. If I don't write this account, it will never be written. As for my beloved son, Will, it is not yet time for me to write his story as I lived it and as I remember it. Where to go with my dreadful list? Is it enough to conclude, as Willa Cather did, that people who go and have grotesque accidents are clowns? Is it enough to talk about depression, inherited insanity, alcoholism, the overprotectiveness of rich white families, the turmoil of the times? Or is the conclusion, as it always has been, silence based on massive denial? We, the survivors, hope that our silence protects our feelings, because guilt is always waiting to spring, a guilt that can't be expunged as long as we wonder for lifetimes about our responsibility for these deaths, as we brood on what we did or didn't do, could or couldn't do to prevent them, When guilt is waiting to strike, silence and denial are our only defense. But there's hubris behind this defense. We choose to protect an image of perfection, especially in its male version, that is not probable or possible, that is not even really human. We also choose to maintain our power, limited at best, to affect the outcome of other people's lives. That hubris needs to be dismantled. If these lives and these deaths could be discussed, we might find a common thread, not by oversimplifying causes, but by looking at a possible link between all these lives, beginning 130 years ago. It is easy to say that many do that too much money is the link, but many of these people really didn't have very much money. And as money is power, it can be used for good or ill. Is inherited money the link? Again, many of these people did not inherit money. In a perhaps vain attempt to forestall Faulkner's saddest word again, I set out to explore the life and death of my little brother. So I will stop there for a few minutes. Laura, do you want to ask one of your questions at this point? I don't know if she can hear me.
Mute
Laura,
myself.
I
Yes,
thought I'd stop there for a few minutes in case you want to ask a question.
absolutely. I was muted and didn't realize it. Common problem. So you've published a number of memoirs, as we know, that have focused on a range of family members, from your paternal grandparents in Passion and Prejudice to the women in your matrilineal line in The Blue Box. Could you talk a little bit more why you chose to focus an entire memoir on Jonathan this time?
I should add that I sometimes think I will never escape from writing about the Bingham family.
You're welcome to share about that too.
Anyway, Jonathan, a particular reason for writing about him is that I think we're all aware these days that something has gone badly wrong for privileged young men and even unprivileged young men in our culture. We have an enormously growing number of suicides of young men in their late teens, early 20s. We have these two disastrous murders that just took place, both carried out by 18-year-old men. And I don't think anyone has much grasp of what is going on. What is the problem here? Each problem, of course, is unique, but I felt that Jonathan's life, even special as it was, as a very privileged young man who grew up in the 40s and 50s, possibly can shed some light on what goes wrong, particularly for a very sensitive young man who doesn't necessarily fit the stereotype of what we expect, and who finds himself in an institution like Harvard, which couldn't be less interested in the emotional problems of their students. So that was the prime reason why I chose it. The other reason was that I was fortunate enough to receive from my sister Eleanor all that Jonathan left, which was not much, because he died when he was 21. So, there's not much accumulated. But she very generously decided to send those on to me. And being a writer, when I get into some research, I have to write. I wouldn't know what else to do with it.
Sure. Well, since you brought up those materials, Jonathan's papers, and because we are here in this wonderful context of the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture, an archive and a library, maybe you would be willing to share a little bit more about those materials that your sister Eleanor shared with you, and what role they played in the formation of this book.
It's very interesting because the last book before this that I wrote and published was a biography of Doris Duke. And in that case, as you know, Laura, you have an enormous archive of her papers, enormous, really daunting to try to go through. With Jonathan, there was probably at most one fairly good sized box. So it was the opposite extreme. There was very little. But in that case, what I found was so important, I was so glad they haven't yet been digitalized, is just the look and the feel of each of those pages. You know, the way the envelope would have been torn when a letter was taken out, you know, indicating perhaps a lot of haste. The look of the stamps from 50 years ago. The look of the way addresses were written, because of course everybody was handwriting addresses then, and handwriting letters. And of course the handwriting in Jonathan's case was so striking because he had very precise, legible handwriting, always writing in ink. And there was never in any of his correspondence to our parents, for example, a crossed out word, a misspelled word. I couldn't believe it. They were just completely clean. And these were first drafts. I don't think he ever contemplated writing a second draft of the letter. So I gained from that, as you do from perusing someone's papers, such a strong feeling of how precise, how controlled, how dedicated he was to doing things right. And I think that's the great pleasure of an archive, because inevitably, it may not even be the words. It may be the look and feel of these papers that are just not replaceable by anything else. And of course, I'm hoping they will go down to you, Laura, when this is all done.
Well, you know, they have a safe home here. It
Yeah.
strikes me though, that one of the other things that strikes me in thinking about the Doris Duke collections and Jonathan's collection is, and you know, the other side of the coin that you described so well, that there are voluminous amounts of material, you know, that sort of document the world around Doris, but not a lot of her own words. Whereas there's only a tiny amount of material that documents Jonathan, but so much of it is his words. I was struck when I read Little Brother by how much, you know, how often you quoted him and how much he sort of leaps off the page in his own words. So, so what was the experience of reading his words after all of these decades?
I had really forgotten, because it's been so long ago, how very articulate he was. I had always remembered that he was extremely bright, but my memory of him really from the last years of his life was that he was so silent. He really almost completely stopped talking, at least in family gatherings. So I had lost track of the fact that he was so very articulate and also so funny, and a wonderful sense of humor. In one letter to our parents from Harvard, this would have been in the early 60s, he says that he's going to a lot of parties and he needs all of his white shirts sent from Kentucky because he doesn't have enough white shirts. The reason he doesn't have enough white shirts is that somehow when they come back from the laundry, they crawl back into the dirty laundry bag. And so he never has a chance to wear them before they go back to the laundry. And that's an example of his sort of fey humor, which I had forgotten.
Well, but also it's sort of, it's very visual, isn't it? It sort of offers up an image of what the life he lived that almost required a uniform, right?
It all did require a uniform.
Yeah, which,
as you noticed from the cover of the book, it looks as though he's in a uniform there, and he's probably 4 years old. That was very
exactly.
much part of the family dynamic. There was a uniform for everything. Even if you're going to go work in the garden, there was a uniform for that.
Right, so the strictures, the framework, the contours of his life were quite fierce, which sort of brings me to another question that came to my mind as I was reading the book. I mean, his story is so deeply intertwined with his privilege as an upper class white man in the first half of the 20th century, and he had, in your depiction, an ambiguous sexual identity. So these were obviously sort of critical set of lenses through which you invited readers to understand his story. Would you share your perspective on how these elements of his identity and experience shaped and even harmed him?
So tricky, because being as repressed as he was, even in the journal he kept in the last months of his life, he didn't really reveal anything. He would just hint. He would say something like, something terrible happened to me last night, but he wouldn't say what it was. So
Mhm.
I can only speculate, remembering that he did not fit what then was the really overpowering male stereotype. He was not big and strong. He never cared much about sports. He was quite soft-spoken, um, really a tender young man. And it seemed from the hints in his journal that his great relationship that just tormented him was with his roommate, Peter, who had been a very close friend in high school and then went on and roomed with him for 3 years at Harvard. And Peter, whom I didn't really know, he died of an overdose about 10 years after Jonathan died. From Jonathan's description, was just this amazing, charismatic, brilliant, loved by the girls, never needed to study and got straight A's. So he was someone that Jonathan deeply admired, and also the relationship, whatever it was, troubled Jonathan deeply, because although our father was bisexual, none of us knew that. I didn't know that until many years later. So there was no image of a man who was attracted to men. There was just nothing. It didn't exist as far as we knew. And I think when he finally decided to leave Harvard, which of course nobody in the family had ever done, nobody had ever dropped out of college. I don't think anybody's dropped out of college to this day. Anyway, what he said in his journal was he was leaving because it was a choice between Peter and nothing. So I think you can imagine what that might mean.
Yes.
It's one of the few really sad things about his life, because I don't really find his life sad, that he couldn't somehow accept whatever part of himself that was that caused him so much torment.
He was tormented by his relationship with his, the woman, lover that he had too, plainly tormented by it.
Figure something went wrong, badly wrong there. And she was very fond of him. She kept trying to see him. She was, I think, at Radcliffe at the time, calling him ceaselessly. He was trying to avoid her because something had just gone badly wrong. I think when they were away on a skiing weekend, and he was so shamed by it, whatever it was, that he just really never wanted to see her again. I never could find what her real name was,
Yeah.
but it was his nickname for her. So I don't know if she's still alive. I don't know where she is. It may be that if this book spreads widely enough, she will turn up.
That's exactly what I wondered.
Yeah, exactly. That would be so fascinating to sit down and talk with her. She would be in her early 80s now, and say, ask her to tell me what she remembers about Jonathan.
Yeah, it would be. I mean, it'd be such an important perspective because it clearly, I mean, his papers, his diaries indicated that he continued to love her. So it wasn't that he was discouraging her because he wasn't interested. It was quite the opposite. So it was quite,
Because he
yeah,
couldn't stand the conflict. The
yeah,
conflict
he
was tearing him to pieces.
almost didn't think he was worthy.
Yeah, and that
Um,
too, Laura, that too.
Yeah, so I think there's probably a great deal of interest circling back around to the start, although I want you to stop me when you want to do some reading from the book, please do. But I'm sure there's interest in the dreadful list. If you wanted to expand on that as a sort of, that's what you led with in this book, that was
one of my goals always as a writer from the very beginning, my first novel was concerned with an illegal pregnancy in the period before Roe v. Wade, and a mother who has to decide what to do for her pregnant daughter. She does eventually find a way to procure an abortion, but that was in 1961, and it was a preoccupation of everybody, but nobody was talking about it. So my great attempt as a writer is to break the silence. And silence has drowned all these 8 people on the dreadful list. I only found out about them through research. These are fairly close relatives. One of them is my first cousin. One of them was my step grandmother, and their stories matter. And I felt it would be startling to start with that list. I think it is startling. I think it raises a lot of questions. It might seem like a terrible invasion of privacy. It might seem like a mistake to dig up these tragedies from some of them from the very distant past. But I don't know any other way to write other than to aim at these silences, because I think it's silence that kills us. It locks us in our isolation. It locks us in our conflicts. I saw this so much growing up in the 50s. There were all kinds of things going on that nobody could mention. And I think it leads to absolute desperation. So that was my reason for the dreadful list. And I do think it legitimately raises a lot of questions. One of my friends who read it said she thought it was in bad taste. And I said, well, you know, sometimes bad taste is necessary.
Well, I mean, that reminds me of, well-behaved, people seldom make history, right? I mean, it's.
That's a good, And you remember, I think it was Rilke who said that literature is the axe that breaks the frozen sea within us. So that implies some force. That frozen sea is not just going to melt and go away. It has to actually be cracked. And that's what I hope my writing does.
Absolutely. And you're teaching. Yeah. So I know that you're about to teach a series of workshops on life writing and memoir and even obituary writing. In the description of these sessions, much like what you were just sharing with us, you suggest that we, quote, need to expand our understanding of memoir. It is actually the writing of history from often ignored points of view. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that framework and this series of writing workshops that you're about to teach.
Yes, this will be in about a week. I'm teaching at the Carnegie Learning Center in Lexington, Kentucky. It's an amazing place. It's a beautiful, big old Carnegie library that's no longer a library. But it's used by a not-for-profit to teach all kinds of writing courses, give lectures, reaches a lot of people. It has a very good outreach program. Sarah Chapman, who runs it, has been enormously helpful to me. So I find, and I teach this workshop a lot, mainly to women, I sometimes get some men, that we are a little timid about embracing the bigger picture. We know about our families, we may know some of the facts of our families' lives, but I've always been struck by the fact that when I start teaching a workshop with people, probably of a certain age, and I ask them what wars affected them and how old were they, for instance, if they were alive during Vietnam. People don't really know because, and I think this is particularly women, we don't necessarily grasp the way these big national and international events affect us as private individuals. And it's so important because the reason our lives have meaning is partly because of the way we intersect and influence, even if unconsciously, these enormous movements going on around us. It's fun to teach that in that way because it sort of surprises people.
Yeah.
And I also like to get people to experiment with writing a memoir from a different point of view. There's a memoir that's been out for a couple of months named Fox and I, which is really from the point of view of this fox that this woman befriended and all of their mysterious interactions, because the fox would come and sit with her every evening. And I thought, what a wonderful idea to write a memoir from the point of view of a fox.
Right.
One of the things we need to do as memoir writers is it can be so intensely subjective that it's a good idea just to practice what it would be like to write a memoir from a very unexpected point of view. So that's another exercise I'll be giving to them. I thought the obit writing workshop was a wonderful idea because it's called Last Words, and it's writing obituaries for people who never had obituaries. Most people have a relative, a friend, somebody that they thought should have had an obituary, but particularly now with newspapers so shrunken, it never happened. And of course, it was always limited to mainly upper class white people. So I thought this would be a great time to draw in some people who did have a relative, maybe an African American who was never written about. But it didn't work, Laura. Nobody signed up.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I'm
well, I
shocked.
think maybe people don't think about obituaries, they think about memorials. But of course, even a memorial has to be written. So
Right.
I'll probably try it again. But this year it didn't work.
I mentioned, that perhaps you could reach out to Alex Kate Schulman about it. She's quite interested in the topic and the idea of obituary as a part of legacy formation.
Right. Oh, that's very important
Yeah,
because, if in 2 generations, everybody is forgotten. And one of the hopes is that at least there's an obituary there that children and grandchildren and friends and other people would have access to. They're not going to see if you have a gravestone, they're not probably going to see it. It's almost the only way to insist that a person lived. It's so easy just to erase people who are not considered important. And almost no one is considered important. It's a very small group.
and as you say, that group mainly has consisted of upper class white men. So this is also a decidedly sort of activist
Absolutely.
enterprise as well.
Yeah. And I notice in my local paper here in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe, New Mexican, that the obituaries, the really long obituaries, are still of these well-off white men. There are a lot of other obituaries, but the really long ones are of those men.
Right. So how empowering would it be for especially women, people of color, queer people to have the opportunity to write their obituary and
Oh.
and to indicate what they think ought to be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Will
Well,
they
we
have
just
that
hope
chance?
maybe next time it'll work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it will. Did you want to read a little bit more
Yeah, let me
of your
read.
book before we open it up for broader Q&A?
I'm
Lovely.
going to read a little bit from chapter 1. A little boy with frail blonde hair, not curly but wavy, almost to his shoulders, not yet cut short. A little boy in short pants, shirt untucked, shoelaces dangling, as he sits in the back seat of the family station wagon, staring out the window. The station wagon, driven by our mother, is gliding down the twisting road that leads to Frankfort, the Kentucky state capital. A steep limestone bluff falls to the right of the road that descends to the town and the Kentucky River. At a break in the bluff, a scenic overlook, our mother pulls off the road. Our 2 older brothers reach for the doors, but there is no time to get out. The stop will be brief. In the back seat, I am watching my little brother. He is staring at the dome of the State House below the bluff. The dome flashes in the afternoon sun. 250 feet high, it is the tallest building the boy has ever seen. Stately paired columns support the dome above the square mass of the Capitol building itself. Our mother explains that they are Corinthian columns, identified by their crowns of carved leaves and flowers. A classic scholar in college, she knows her columns. The little boy doesn't seem to hear. He is staring at the gilded dome. If that isn't beautiful, nothing is, he says. Our 2 older brothers guffaw. They have already seen something of the world. I do not laugh. I have not seen anything of the world. I know how tender my little boy has been, my little brother has been, from the very beginning when I knelt by his bed on the day of his christening and saw him copy with his tiny mouth the O of excitement I was making. I want to shield him from our older brother's jeering, but then I realized that Jonathan is not listening. He is absorbed in the beauty of the gilded dome. I was and am that big sister. This is my story of my little brother Jonathan Worth Bingham's. Not his older brother's story, not his much younger sister's story, who gave me the records and photographs that remain from his life. Not his friends' stories, mine. Partly based on memory with its inevitable distortions, deletions, and delusions. Partly drawn from the small collection of letters, photographs, and school reports, which our mother began to collect in 1942, when Jonathan, a sickly baby, was born. I'll stop there.
That was lovely, Sallie.
Are you there, Laura?
I am there, and I want to thank you. That was lovely. It's wonderful to hear you read.
Thank you.
I think if you're ready, we might open for a broader Q&A, a question and answer period, to allow our audience members a chance to ask some questions.
Good.
So again, I invite folks to place their questions in the chat or use the raised hand feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window behind reactions. Kelly, would you like to moderate this, or would you like for me to?
I think you can moderate and then call on Jeanette to get started, and I'll jump in if I notice anything else.
Perfect. Jeanette, you're welcome to turn on your camera and unmute if you'd like to. Jeanette?
Can she hear us?
I thought so.
Maybe she's on mute.
I'm
So
working on my settings. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. So Jeanette, give us a second while Kelly works on the settings, and we have a question from Janet Boyd. What, in your opinion, is the most important aspect of writing memoir?
The truth. And I think you need to claim as the writer that you know the truth. Not that it's the only truth, but it's your truth. And it means being bold. You can't write memoir and hide behind being polite, being tactful, worrying about other people's reaction. You have to be bold and grasp the truth, which Shakespeare said was a thistle. It is a thistle. It might well sting you, it might sting other people. But that's really the point of writing memoir.
That's lovely. Thank you. So Kelly, are we ready for folks who want to unmute?
I believe so. Let's give it a whirl with Jeanette.
Right. So, hi, Sallie. This is Jeanette Stokes.
Hi.
It's very nice to see you.
Thank you.
I have, and I wasn't able to turn on my video, so I'll speak to you from the dark. First, I have a comment, which is I just want to commend you for continuing to write. I know that you're a writer, but I know too many people who've stopped at a certain age. So I'm just so glad that you are still publishing and that you're using your brave and beautiful voice. My question is that I know when you published, I believe your first memoir, Passion and Prejudice, that some of your family members objected strongly. And so I'm wondering whether, except for the friend who read it and thought it was not quite the thing to publish, whether you have had any other resistance, or with this history of your brother's life being so far in the past, whether you had a sort of unobstructed road in this project.
So far, this road has been unobstructed, Jeanette, and I think it's because so many years have passed. Everyone in the family, except for my sister who knew him, has died. He doesn't probably mean very much to nephews and nieces and great nephews and nieces. So I don't anticipate a lot of negativity. You never know, because again, I'm uncovering things that many people would prefer not to be uncovered. My family's reaction to Passion and Prejudice after all these years, I have to just laugh about it, because at the time I wasn't laughing about it. My mother hired a team of lawyers to go through my manuscript, and after Knopf said they wouldn't drop it. They were very brave about it. to go through my manuscript and find all the errors. And they produced something that was as thick as a telephone book. And I can't tell you how much it cost. It must have cost thousands of dollars. Some of it was pages from old telephone books to prove that I had given the wrong street number to some great grandparents' house in Louisville. It didn't have any influence on my editors who knew the book well, but it had a huge influence on reviewers. You can imagine if you were a book reviewer at a newspaper somewhere, and this telephone sized thing lands on your desk, well, it's going to make a big impression. So my reviews were quite painful, a lot of them. Not the one in the New Yorker, that was the positive one. And that shouldn't have come as a surprise, but it did. So I think that's the toughest resistance I've ever had to face. And my mother had told me when I told her I had a contract to write this book, that if I mentioned my step-grandmother, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler Bingham, she would never speak to me again. And I went home, I had a terrible time because I thought, if I give in to this, my career as a writer is finished. So I did write about Mary Lily, and she did never speak to me again. So that's the kind of price you sometimes pay for telling the truth, or the truth as I saw it. It's worth it. I never have felt it's not worth it, but it's also, I think, for everybody to some degree dangerous. Probably less dangerous in families that are not so self-important. But in that family, any hint of criticism was just intolerable. Jeanette, did I answer you? I don't know if I did or not.
Yes, thank you, Sally. Yes.
You're very welcome.
So Jane Beaver has a question for you. She says, a writing friend and I have long talked about writing our own obituaries, but it's yet to be done. Will you ever give the workshop on Zoom that you mentioned earlier, the obituary workshop? I know we would both love to participate.
Oh, that's great. I would love to do that. I have to see if the Carnegie Learning Center would be interested in sponsoring that. But thank you. That's a very good idea. I do think it could be extremely interesting. I mean, people might even want to write their own obituaries. That's not impossible. So thank you. I'll see if I can follow up on that.
Thank you. Are there other questions that people might have?
Jane.
Sarah Gorham has her hand raised. Sarah, would you like to unmute?
Hi,
Hi.
I am not that young. That's my granddaughter.
Oh,
Sally, Sally, when you look back on your extraordinary career, what comes to mind for you? I mean, I've never heard of anybody who has written for such a long period and lived so long. So I'd love to know what comes to mind.
what comes to mind is lack of gratitude. I was one of those, and still am, one of those very ambitious women for whom nothing is ever enough. And I remember when my first novel was published in 1961, and it was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times. Well, instead of just being unbelievably pleased, I was furious because it was a shared review with another first novel by a young woman. And that just ruined it from my point of view. Can you imagine anybody being that, shall we say, vainglorious? So I think all along I've gotten too discouraged. You know, there are years between books being published. It's true for every writer. It doesn't matter how much you write. You're not going to be published every year or even every 2 or 3 years. And I think I wasn't able to realize that I've been so fortunate, so privileged, because, you know, I've written probably 80% of what I've written has not been published. Well, a lot of it probably doesn't deserve to be published, but that's what happens to you. And I don't I really credit myself for being that ambitious because particularly in the period when I grew up in the 40s and 50s, that was not an acceptable trait for a woman, whether a writer or not, to be that ambitious. But now at last in my extreme age, I am very grateful, particularly for Sarah Mann books. Sarah, I was trying to remember, is this my 5th book you've published? I think it is.
Yeah, yeah, I would say 5th or 6th,
Or
maybe.
6th.
I'm not sure. I don't have to list it for me.
That's an extraordinary record.
It's a lot.
Very few publishers will ever stick with a writer through 6 books, unless,
Yeah.
you know, they're a bestseller, which I never aspired to be, fortunately. So it's just a great token of your loyalty and your appreciation. And of course, it's true for other writers that you publish too. I hope I will never again lack for gratitude. It may come over me, but I hope it doesn't.
So I want to share that there are a couple of people, at least in the audience, it's hard to keep up with the chat's gotten a little bit, it's got very exciting, who are also interested in writing their own memoirs. Vanessa Folix, Shirley Carr, and perhaps others. So there are a growing number of women in the audience right now, Sallie, who are inspired to, or who are interested in writing their own memoirs. But I want to next call on Elizabeth Dunn, who has a question. So Elizabeth, I invite you to unmute.
Okay, I am unmuted. Hi, Sallie. It's so good to see
Hi, Elizabeth. I
you.
wish I could see your face, but I can't.
Well, I could probably show my video too. So I have, of course, being a retired now archivist, I have questions about sources. So one question I have is, were you able to, or did you even try to get materials from the Harvard University archives about your brother and his life there, the classes he took? Maybe I'm imagining the dean of students writing a letter about young Jonathan Bingham's decision to leave school and why he did that, or I don't know what might be there or might not.
Gosh, I'm ashamed to say I never approached Harvard. I have a terrible
Oh,
black feeling about Harvard.
oh,
You
yeah.
know, they also ate up my college, Radcliffe, a few years ago. So I don't think I would feel at all comfortable trying to approach them. As to what classes he was taking, he includes a lot of that in his letters, talking to our parents about what he was taking. And I don't think there was any reaction at all to him. Oh yeah, there was one letter concerning his dropping out, in which whoever he had gone to talk to said, oh yes, it's a good idea to drop out, take some time off and find out what's troubling you. But it was very pallid. It was just a kind of almost a form letter.
Mhm.
And Harvard, like many institutions, often does not want to deal with the people who are not happy there. That's not part of their.
Yes, yes. They're happy to get rid of anybody who might be troubled or bring any kind of shadow. Yeah.
I don't know if that's an adequate response. I mean, I think probably I should have. I had made a decision early on that I wouldn't try to interview anybody. First of all, most of the people who knew him are now dead. But I felt if I interviewed people, I was going to get into a lot of arguing, disagreement, people who wouldn't appreciate my approach. And it's very hard as a writer to deal with that kind of interview because you can't really discredit people. You have to give them, you know, the power of their own opinions. But I always have felt about my point of view, particularly about family members, that it's very unlikely to be shared. Maybe I go too far in that direction. But I think usually there's just such an emphasis on correctness, civility, politeness, that it's very hard to talk to people. And I think Harvard falls into that same category.
I would observe, I think you know your family very well, and you can accurately anticipate what their responses would be and whether they would be helpful or not. And it sounds like not.
I don't think so. And
No.
as I say, everybody except for my younger sister who knew him is dead. So, you know, you would be getting secondhand memories at best. Anyway, I'm just kind of stubborn in that way. I have my own story I want to tell and probably not real interested in hearing other people's stories. They can write their stories if they want to.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. I look forward to reading this book.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think that Fabienne Worth has had her hand raised, their hand raised for some time. So would you like to unmute?
Okay. Hi, Sallie Bingham. It's very good to see you. I took a workshop with you about 1 million years ago, and I'm
Oh,
so glad we're both still here.
Are you in your car?
No, I am at home.
Oh,
I'm at
good.
home. Let's see if I can get the video going. Yes, here I am.
Good.
Okay, okay. I was very interested in your comment about Memoir daring to put the writer's voice inside a big perspective, because the memoir I've been writing for 20 years is very affected by a repetition of wars in my family, each generation. And I do feel that it's continuing to affect even my nephews, you know, down the line, we don't even know about this history. And so that gives me, that empowers me to, you know, to use that as a frame for my memoir, which I intuit, but sometimes I feel Americans are so non-interested in history and so dismissive about history and about context. You know, they just are interested in emotions.
Yeah.
And so I get a bit discouraged, you know, because I'm not an American and yet I want to have an American audience. So, you know, so where is the fine line, you know? So it feels really good to hear you being so decisive behind this approach.
And don't be discouraged, because this question of why we care so little about history, know so little about history, is just crucial. And I think you will find as you begin writing that because you're talking about the wars in terms of these particular individuals who experienced them or knew about them, people tend then to get a little more interested.
Yeah.
Because as you say, we're only interested in emotional, we're only interested in
Yeah.
personal, but that's the way in, because you'll be saying, you know, my uncle had this experience in Vietnam or whatever it is, but it is the personal as well as the historical. Really urge you not to give up. This is such an important point of view.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fabienne. I think we have time for one more question, and I see that Beth Doyle has her hand raised. So Beth, would you like to unmute and even turn on your camera if you'd like?
Hi, Sallie. So good to see you.
Oh, thank you. I wish I could see you. I can't.
You can.
No, I think the video situation.
Oh, I'm sorry. So as the head of conservation for Duke Libraries, you know that I am very interested in saving the historical record.
Right.
And I am particularly interested in saving the historical record of women and their experiences in this country. I've had some recent conversations with colleagues who are like, who am I to save things? I'm not that important. So
Yeah.
what kind of words of encouragement or advice could you give people, especially women, to reverse that thinking and save their stuff for future researchers? Because
Oh, that's
our histories are going to depend on us to save things.
Yeah, we do. Well, first of all, try to, whatever woman you're talking to, try to emphasize that her experience is unique. Whatever it is, nobody else is ever going to write about it. Nobody else is probably even going to know about it. And in terms of the importance of preserving not just letters, but everything that has been important to her in her life, this may make a challenge for the archivist, but I'm reminded of those 2 pin cushions that I gave to you, Laura, you remember? These were pin cushions made 150 years ago by a woman who was not considered to be of any importance. Probably if a woman hadn't saved them, they would have been thrown out. And I say a woman because we are the great preservers and savers, as you know. Those pin cushions tell me more about that forgotten woman's life, because I don't know any facts. I just know her name, than anything else that might have been saved. So it's a broader field. I think we think too often that, oh, it's just letters and I don't write letters or I don't get letters. And of course, there are not going to be any more letters now. Letters are finished because of email. But everything that is important to an individual woman has an historical importance. And I think if you emphasize that and try to allow these women to outgrow their self-doubt and to realize that they're very important parts of the history of their times and their country, we just can't allow ourselves to be vanished, because that's what's happened for so many hundreds of years with women. As you know, it's only recently, maybe in the last 20 years, that we're beginning to read biographies of women who were not considered important. A new biography just out called Ben's Women, about Benjamin Franklin's many, many woman friends. I'd never heard of any of them before. That's where we're now beginning to notice that so much of life is lived through women, through the eyes of women, and we just can't let ourselves be vanquished by a culture that keeps trying to insist that we don't matter. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's fantastic.
By the way, if anyone wants to, I don't know how many of you are in Kentucky, probably not too many, but if anyone wants to sign up for this workshop I'm teaching next Thursday and Friday in a week at the Carnegie Center in Lexington, I know there's still spaces, and it just means getting on the website of the Carnegie Learning Center and seeing what workshops they're offering.
Well, we are just about at 3 o'clock, and that was such a perfect question, Beth, to end on, such a perfect sentiment for us to reflect on here in this Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture hosted event. It is such a pleasure. It's such an honor to spend some time with you here this afternoon, Sallie. So I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your willingness to spend time with all of us today, and to wish you well in your upcoming travel. And all summer.
Oh,
as
thank
the
you,
months
Laura.
unfold.
It's such a privilege for me. I live in a fairly remote part of this country. I've spent a lot of time alone. And just to see that there are this many women who are that interested in my work, you can't imagine how rewarding that is for me.
That's perfect. That's just perfect. And I see that Kelly has dropped in the chat a link, so that people can click on to buy Little Brother and your other books. And I also see lots of thanks and approbation, richly deserved. So thank you again, Sallie.
Thanks to all of you. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.